Ever get that feeling like life is one giant puzzle? Like, where do we even fit in, you know?
Definitely. And there are so many pieces to try to put together.
Exactly. But hey, that's what we're here for, right? Welcome to another deep dive where we try to make some sense of it all. And today we've got some seriously cool pieces to work with. We're talking evolution, genetics, the whole shebang.
Should be interesting. 3 books on the docket today.
You know it. We're cracking open Darwin's On the Origin of Species, of course.
Classics.
Then we're going to jump into Dawkins, the selfish gene.
Always good for sparking a debate.
Oh, for sure. And to round things out, we're going to see those ideas play out at the cellular level with Siddhartha Mukherjee's The Song of the Cell.
Now that's a trio I haven't considered together before. I'm intrigued.
Me too. It's like seeing these big ideas from totally different angles. But okay, let's rewind back to the OG, Charles Darwin himself. Now, most folks, they hear Darwin, they think finches, right? Maybe those giant tortoises.
The Galapagos gets all the glory for sure.
But you know where Darwin's journey to cracking evolution really started?
Don't tell me.
Pigeons.
Pigeons. Can you believe that? He was obsessed with breeding pigeons.
Well, domesticated species in general, really. He was fascinated by the variations breeders could achieve. He even called it a system in his writing.
A system? Like he thought you could just plug in the traits you wanted and bam, out pops a custom-made creature. Kind of. He thought there were rules to how traits were passed down. But here's the thing. Even under those controlled breeding conditions, things didn't always go according to plan. In fact, he specifically points out how this system can act irregularly, as he put it, under confinement.
So even when you're trying to control things, nature finds a way to mix it up.
Exactly. And for Darwin, that was huge. It meant that offspring weren't always carbon copies of their parents. There was this inherent variability that he just couldn't ignore.
Which makes sense when you think about it. Even in a litter of puppies, they're all a little different.
Exactly. And that irregularity, that was a major clue for Darwin about how inheritance worked, even though he didn't have the tools to understand it fully. I mean, think about it. This was way before we knew about DNA or genes.
He was working with what he could see. And what he saw was that traits were being passed down, but sometimes in unpredictable ways. Wild.
Totally. And, to really grasp how revolutionary Darwin's observations were, we have to remember the context. Here he is, piecing together this idea of inheritance before anyone even knew genes existed.
Yeah.
He's looking at things like the webbed feet of geese, right? Or the bone structure of a bat's wing compared to a human hand.
Which, side note, super creepy if you think about it too hard.
For sure.
Yeah.
But Darwin, he sees these similarities and he's like, wait a minute, this can't be a coincidence.
More like an echo of a shared history.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. He realized these weren't just random similarities, they were echoes of a shared ancestry, which, let's be real, was a pretty bold conclusion to draw back then.
It's like he was putting together a puzzle, but he didn't even have the box to know what the final picture was supposed to be.
The best kind of puzzle. And
Yeah.
that idea, that concept of shared ancestry, it's not just central to evolution. It's the foundation of modern genetics as we know it. Darwin laid the groundwork for understanding how deeply connected all life on Earth really is.
No big deal, just revolutionized our understanding of life itself. But, just when we're starting to feel good about wrapping our heads around inheritance and shared ancestry.
Enter stage left. Richard Dawkins.
Right. With the selfish gene. And I gotta admit, that title always kind of makes me go, okay, let's see where this is going.
Yeah, Dawkins knew it was a bit provocative. He even called it a warning to the reader.
A warning? That's intense.
Well, he knew people might hear selfish gene and think he's advocating for, actually being selfish. But that wasn't his point at all.
So it's less about morality and more about how genes operate on a fundamental level.
Exactly. He's using selfish as a metaphor to explain this biological imperative of genes to survive and replicate. It's like their prime directive. Must make more copies.
Like a copy machine that just can't stop itself.
Kind of. And while that might seem a bit cold and calculated, it's actually this really elegant explanation for how life has persisted and diversified over billions of years.
Okay, I'm starting to see it. So it's not about us trying to be selfish jerks. It's about understanding this underlying drive in our genes that's been shaping life since, well, forever. But then that begs the question, if it's all about me at the gene level, how do you explain things like, I don't know, altruism?
The altruism paradox. It's a great question, and something Dawkins tackles head on in The Selfish Gene. He uses a really interesting example, the albino gene.
Okay, I vaguely remember this part. Refresh my memory. How does albinism tie into altruism?
Right, so it's not that the gene itself is being altruistic. Genes aren't making conscious moral choices, right?
Right, they're not exactly saints over there in gene land.
Exactly. But what Dawkins proposes is this idea that a gene can have what he calls a double effect.
Double effect. Okay, you're going to have to break that down for me.
Sure. So one effect is the obvious one, the trait itself, in this case, albinism. But the other effect is how that trait might influence the behavior of other individuals toward the one carrying that gene.
Hold on. So you're saying a gene could be responsible not just for, say, making an animal albino, but also for how other animals react to that albino animal.
Exactly. Imagine for a second that alongside causing albinism, this gene also, in a roundabout way, influences relatives of an albino animal to be more protective of it.
Interesting. So it's not that the gene is sitting there thinking, be nice to albinos. It's more like over time, the genes that just happen to have both of these effects, creating the trait and encouraging a protective response well, those genes would have a better chance of being passed down just by chance.
Precisely. Because even if an individual albino animal, say, doesn't survive to reproduce, the very act of its relatives protecting it, who are also likely to carry that same gene, well, that increases the chances of that gene, surviving into the next generation.
Whoa. So you're saying that even our most complex social behaviors, even altruism, could be influenced by these hidden genetic mechanisms that have been playing out over millions of years.
That's the power of looking at evolution through the lens of the gene. It can really challenge our assumptions and offer new perspectives on even our most deeply ingrained behaviors.
It's like Dawkins is handing us this whole new way of seeing the world, right? Like we're not just individuals acting in isolation. We're part of this grand evolutionary story that's been unfolding for billions of years.
Absolutely. And speaking of seeing things in new ways, that leads us perfectly to our third book for today, Siddhartha Mukherjee's The Song of the Cell.
Where Dawkins takes us deep into the world of genes, Mukherjee takes us even deeper into the bustling metropolis of the cell itself.
I love that analogy. It's like if genes are the composers, then cells are the orchestra, the instruments bringing that intricate symphony of life to life.
And man, what a symphony it is. Mukherjee really drives home the point that so much of what makes us human, our health, our development, even our susceptibility to disease, it all comes down to the cellular level.
He dives into the nitty-gritty of how cells communicate, how they specialize, how they work together to form complex tissues and organs. It's truly remarkable.
It really is. Like even just a simple act, a child taking their first step, that requires the coordinated effort of billions of cells.
Talk about teamwork. And just like any good team, when things start to break down at the cellular level, that's when we run into problems, which is exactly where Mukherjee takes us next. He doesn't shy away from the darker side of cellular dysfunction, exploring things like cancer, Alzheimer's, autoimmune disorders.
Right, because if we can understand how these diseases work at the cellular level, that gives us a fighting chance of developing new treatments, even cures, right?
Absolutely. And this is where we start to see the threads of all three of our book really weaving together.
Oh, tell me more about that. How does it all connect?
Well, remember how Darwin observed all those variations within a species? He could see the differences, but he didn't have the tools to explain what caused them. Well, now we know that those variations, they ultimately stem from differences at the cellular level. How cells adapt and respond to environmental pressures, how they mutate and evolve over time.
So it's like zoom all the way in from a whole flock of finches to the tiny world inside a single cell, and that's where the real action is happening.
Precisely. And what about Dawkins's selfish genes? They might be calling the shots, so to speak, but they can't do it alone. They rely on the intricate machinery of the cell to replicate, to translate their genetic code into proteins, to basically carry out their mission.
It's like Mukherjee is providing that high-definition close-up, showing us the intricate molecular dance that makes both evolution and genetic inheritance possible.
I love that. It's like we've gone from this grand, sweeping view of life on Earth to this incredibly detailed, almost microscopic perspective, all thanks to these three brilliant minds.
Talk about a deep dive. And speaking of diving deeper, one of the things I found most fascinating in The Song of the Cell was the story of Louise Brown, the world's first test tube baby.
Ah, yes. Louise Brown's birth was a landmark moment in reproductive technology.
It's a story most people have at least heard of, but when you actually understand the science behind it, it's mind-blowing. Mukherjee walks us through the entire process of in vitro fertilization, extracting the egg, fertilizing it in a petri dish, carefully transferring the embryo back into the womb.
And to think, all of that was made possible by understanding how cells work. It opened up the possibility of parenthood to so many couples who thought it would never happen for them.
Talk about a life-changing scientific breakthrough. Though, like with many advancements in science, it does come with a whole new set of ethical considerations.
For sure. The ability to create life in a lab, to manipulate those very building blocks of life, that raises a whole host of complex questions.
No kidding. And those questions become even more ethically murky when you consider another story that Mukherjee covers, the controversial CRISPR baby experiment in China.
Oh, right. That was back in 2018 when a Chinese scientist used CRISPR technology to edit the genes of twin girls while they were still embryos.
And if memory serves, the stated goal was to make them resistant to HIV, right? But the scientific community was up in arms about it.
With good reason. Because this wasn't simply about treating a disease, it was about making heritable changes to the human germline. Meaning those genetic alterations, they wouldn't just affect those twin girls, they could potentially be passed down to their children and their children's children.
Talk about a ripple effect.
No kidding. And it immediately sparked a huge debate about how far we should go with gene editing. A debate that, I might add, is still raging on today.
It's a powerful reminder that understanding the science, the how-tos of it all, that's one thing. But grappling with the ethical implications, the should we even do this questions, that's just as important.
More important, I'd argue. Because with great power comes great responsibility.
Right?
And the power to manipulate life at the cellular level, well, that's about as big as it gets.
No doubt about it. It really makes you think, like, are we really in control of our own destinies, or are we just like vehicles for our genes to keep on trekking through time?
It's a mind-boggling question for sure. But even if our genes are pulling some of the strings, I don't think that means we're completely off the hook,
Okay, I'm listening. How do we wrestle back some control then?
Well, for starters, just being aware of this selfish gene concept, that's huge. It lets us take a step back and say, okay, I see what you're doing there, genes, trying to maximize your own survival and all that. But I'm not just going to blindly follow your every whim.
So knowledge is power.
Exactly. Because when we understand the underlying mechanisms, that gives us the power to make more conscious choices. We can choose to cooperate, to be altruistic, even when our genes might be whispering, hey, looking for number one.
It's like we've got this whole other layer of decision-making going on. It's not just about survival of the fittest anymore. It's about survival of the, most cooperative, the most compassionate.
I like that. Survival of the kindest.
Right.
And that's a future I think we can all get behind. But anyway, before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's get back to Mukherjee and the Song of the Cell.
Right, because all this talk about genes is kind of abstract, isn't it? Like, where is all this genetic action actually happening?
Exactly. Dawkins takes us deep into the world of genes, but Mukherjee, he takes us even deeper, into the bustling metropolis of the cell itself.
Which, side note, when you really think about it, cells are like these tiny universes.
Right. Trillions of them, all working together to keep us alive and functioning. It's mind-blowing. And Mukherjee, he's like our guide through this incredible microscopic world.
And what I love about his book is that he really brings it down to earth, He connects this cellular world to our everyday experiences. Like, remember the story of Louise Brown, the world's first test tube baby?
Oh, how could I forget?
Such a landmark achievement.
Right. And it's a story I think most people are at least somewhat familiar with. But when Mukherjee takes us behind the scenes, explains the science of in vitro fertilization in detail, it's amazing.
It really shows you the power of understanding how cells work. By carefully manipulating those building blocks of life, scientists were able to help create a whole human being. Talk about a life-changing breakthrough. But, as with so many advances in science, there's always this ethical tightrope walk, isn't there?
Absolutely. When we gain the ability to manipulate life at that level, it raises a whole host of complex questions. Questions about when life begins, about who has the right to create life, about the potential for unintended consequences.
And those questions become even thornier, even a little bit scary, if I'm being honest, when you consider another story that Mukherjee covers, the CRISPR baby experiment in China.
Yeah, that was a tough one, a real ethical minefield.
Okay, for anyone who missed that headline, this was back in 2018 when a Chinese scientist used CRISPR technology to edit the genes of twin girls while they were still embryos.
His stated goal was to make them resistant to HIV, but the scientific community was, well, let's just say, not pleased.
Rightfully so, I'd say, because this wasn't just about treating a disease, it was about making heritable changes to the human germline. Those girls, if they have children someday, they could pass those genetic alterations on to their kids and their kids' kids.
It's that whole ripple effect idea again, but on a whole other level. And it really throws into sharp relief this question of, just because we can do something, does that mean we should?
A question we're going to have to grapple with more and more as our ability to manipulate life at the cellular level continues to advance.
No doubt about it. It's a brave new world out there. We're all just trying to figure out the rules as we go.
Honestly, it's kind of mind-blowing how fast this field is moving. It seems like just yesterday we were celebrating the first test tube baby, and now we're talking about editing the human germline like it's no big deal. Except, it is a big deal.
Huge.
Yeah.
And it really highlights this crucial point. Understanding the science, the how-tos, that's just the first step, really.
Right. It's like, congrats, you got the keys to the Ferrari. Doesn't mean you're ready for the Autobahn.
Perfect analogy. And the ethical considerations, these should we even be doing this questions, those are way harder to grapple with.
No doubt. But I gotta think, if we can approach these new technologies with, some humility, maybe a good dose of caution.
A lot of open conversation.
Yes, absolutely. We can't just leave it up to the scientists to figure this out, right? We're all stakeholders in the future of life itself.
100%. And this is where I think both Dawkins and Mukherjee offer some really valuable insights.
Oh, interesting. Okay, bridge that gap for me. How do these books, which seem so different, how do they connect to this whole ethical dilemma?
Well, Dawkins, with his selfish gene concept, he reminds us that we're not just isolated individuals, right? We're part of this vast interconnected web of life. Our actions, even at the cellular level, have ripple effects we might not even be able to imagine.
So it's like what we do to our own genes, we're potentially doing to future generations as well. Talk about pressure.
Exactly. And that's a huge responsibility. Then you've got Mukherjee with his focus on the cell as this fundamental unit of life, and he just hammers home the interconnectedness of all living things. He shows how even tiny disruptions at the cellular level, they can have huge consequences, not just for our own health, but for the environment, for the entire planet.
It's like that old saying, everything is connected to everything else, except now we're seeing that play out at the most basic level of life itself.
Precisely. So as we develop these increasingly powerful tools to manipulate cells, gene editing, synthetic biology, the list goes on, we absolutely have to proceed with caution.
With a lot of really smart people in the room asking the tough questions.
Yes, because the decisions we're making today about how we use these technologies, they could impact life on this planet for thousands, maybe even millions of years to come.
Ooh, whoa, okay. Big picture stuff. No pressure, right? But in all seriousness, I think that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating, but also a little bit daunting. It's exciting to think about the possibilities, but there's also this enormous weight of responsibility that comes with it.
I couldn't agree more. And for me, that's the biggest takeaway from exploring these three incredible books. It's not just about marveling at the science. It's about using that knowledge wisely and ethically to shape a future that benefits all of us.
Well said. So, to all our listeners out there, it's time to put on your thinking caps. Because this isn't just about the science anymore, it's about what kind of future we want to create. And to do that, we need everyone at the table asking the tough questions, having those sometimes uncomfortable conversations.
Absolutely. Because the future's unwritten, and we've all got a hand in writing it.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those big questions. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing, keep those conversations going, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.
मलाई लिङ्कट्रीमा र इन्स्टाग्राममा फलो गरिदिनु होला nirajan.cosmos अनि भिडियो मन परे लाइक गर्नु होला सब्स्क्राइब गर्नु होला च्यानललाई एन्ड क्लिक अन द बेल आइकन फर मोर एन्ड प्लिज शेयर दिस भिडियो थ्याङ्क यू